We have values regardless of how much money we have. And we have values when we are rich. We have values when we are poor. How much money we have does not determine our value at all. That's something that we need to just internalize.
In this podcast, I talk with Ceres Chua, a money psychologist who specializes in the emotional and behavioral roots of financial habits. She's the author of the newsletter Mind Over Money, which you can find on her acclaimed blog, themoneymindsetlab.com. Ceres Chua, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
My first question to you is, what do people get wrong about money?
Yeah, so I'm going to approach this a little bit differently. I believe money is a tool, very much like how our phone is a tool, right? So our phone lets us do things like look up something online, maybe even connect with our loved ones. A lot of times our phone is an entertainment, right? But instead of using it as a tool, for many people, their phone has become an addiction. And they kind of have to wean themselves off it, right? Money is the same way. It's supposed to be a tool that allows us to live the life that we want. Maybe it's to travel a little bit, and it's to connect with loved ones, to see them, every year, every, quarter, or whatever it may be. Yet for many people, we've actually become slaves to money. So in my coaching, I actually put a lot of emphasis on helping people manage their money based on their money archetypes. So money archetypes are certain myths that we believe. So some people are money avoidance, for example. They avoid talking about money at all costs because they feel uncomfortable, or maybe they feel shameful even. And then there are other people who are more money worshipers. These people literally think that having money solves all their problems, right? And then there are people who are more money vigilance. And these people I'm very familiar with, because I'm one of them, is we save every dollar. We save for the rainy day in the future, right? All these money archetypes represents our relationship with money that is unhealthy in some way, shape, or form. And they are all driven by money scripts that we have running in our head. So whether that is the belief that money solves all our problems, or that money is meant to be saved, not spent, right? There's all kinds of money scripts that is running through our head. And the thing is, most of us don't even know that we have these money scripts running in our head. And just like our addiction to our phones, we actually become slaves to money instead of using money to empower us to live in the life that we want, because we have these money script that's basically dictating how we feel about money or how we treat money. So going back to what people get wrong about money, the answer is this. I think we need to start thinking of money as one of many tools we have available to us to live the life that we want, right? We need to be conscious of and break out of this money script that we have running in our head that is essentially enslaving us to money. And we need to actively working on that, having that mastery over money, so that we can use it as a tool, because it really is, instead of being the other way around, which is what's happening for a lot of people.
There is this one persistent myth you write about, the idea that looking rich is more important than being financially secure. Why do you think this money status myth is so powerful, and how can people break free from it?
So I'll give you a U.S. perspective, because I do live in the U.S. I've been here for a long, long time. So in the U.S., there really is a stigma associated with being poor. We seem to associate being poor with being lazy. And really nobody wants to be known as lazy. It's a character flaw, right, to be lazy. So the poorer we are, the more we are incentivized to hide that we don't have money, right? And one of the best ways to do that is actually to pretend to be rich. And you pretend to be rich by looking rich. So it's a catch-22 in some sense. And I would just say that I start off by saying that is a US-centric view, but truth of the matter is US has sort of exported a lot of our culture and our thinking. So that stigma, I would say, has traveled pretty far and planted itself in many different parts of the world. So I think this is applicable to a lot of places as well. And then what we need to realize is that this is not an issue about money at all. This is ultimately an issue about self-worth. Because if we truly want to break away from money status, we need to realize that and we need to understand that. And that's the first step. Money is not self-worth. Self-worth is the intrinsic belief in one's value. Self-worth is completely independent of external achievements or validations. In other words, we have values regardless of how much money we have. And we have values when we are rich. We have values when we are poor. How much money we have does not determine our value at all. That's something that we need to just internalize, right? Now, I know it's easy for me to say that here, but in the real world, it's not as easy to implement because we constantly bombarded with messages that equates money, money with worth, right? And vice versa, even for that matter. But in many ways, many of us, we're on this journey now, and we'll continue to be on this journey for the rest of our lives, right? It's just a reality. And that's okay, because debunking money myths is always a process, right? I don't think we fully break free, like I, allude earlier to these money scripts that we have running in our head. And for those of us who believe in the myths, I think we continue to live with it, but we can work towards breaking that so that we're not tied to that. We don't no longer believe that, even if it takes us a while to kind of behaviorally work out of that.
So in one of your blog posts, you talk about we are wired to delay making financial decisions, and that making financial decisions triggers the same brain regions as physical pain. Can you explain that?
Sure. So if you think about making decisions, especially financial decisions, right, there are many reasons we delay making it, right? So one could be uncertainty. We just don't know about the decisions that we need to make or how to evaluate the ultimate outcome, right? So that happens maybe with, let's say, choosing the right index funds so we can add to our portfolio. That's a very classic example. We don't know. We just don't know what we don't know. Another could be choice overload, which is the opposite of that. We sometimes are presented with so many choices that it just leads us to paralysis. So paralysis could be one of two things. It could be decision paralysis, where we end up making no decisions at all, or it could be analysis paralysis, which we just get stuck in this loop of constant analysis without actually arriving at anything, any kind of decision. So when scientists actually study the brain while we're under this kind of condition of trying to make decisions using fMRI, what they found is that there's a region in our brain called amygdala. Amygdala is the region of brain that triggers fears and pain in us, right?
Mm-hmm.
That region of the brain actually is lit up. So in essence, making financial decisions literally causes our brain to signal pain and fear.
Amazing.
So yeah, it's biologically based when I, say that it triggers pain. So let's talk actually a little bit about the pain, because I think it's not very obvious to people. So the pain is not physical, obviously, right? It's not like we stub our toes or like we slept funny and we woke up the next day with like a crink in our neck or something like that. But that actually doesn't matter to our brain. Our brain processes pain the same way. So let me give you an example.
Mm-hmm.
So we've all lost somebody or something, same thing being maybe a pet or something like that, right? Somebody that we love, something that we love. And sometimes just like a place or a thing might trigger memories of them. And if the memory is still really raw and really painful, sometimes we just try to avoid that pain, that place or that thing, right? We do so instinctively to protect ourselves from feeling the pain. But you know what? That pain has no physical origin. It's not like we step our toes or, like we wake up with a crink in the neck. No, but we still feel that pain, right? So it's similar. There's no physical origin in why we feel pain when it comes to making financial decisions, but it's still pain that our body feels.
Sure.
Right. So now the next question is, well, why do we even evolve to have that kind of, like, how do we even evolve to feel pain when we have to make financial decisions? Turns out that evolution psychologists, so not just evolution biologists, but evolution psychologists have actually studied this, and they theorize that we evolved to actually associate making decisions with pain because there is an advantage to it. There's an evolutionary advantage. So yes, when we're prehistoric, we're not really making financial decisions, but we're still making decisions, right? So if you think back, prehistoric time, almost everything is dangerous, right? So it's an evolution advantage to actually avoid making decisions sometimes
Yeah, got it.
because if we don't make a decision, then we sort of stay where we are. We stick with what we already know is safe instead of like making decisions that may kill us, right? So there is evolutionary advantage to feeling pain when you have to make decisions that is uncomfortable, that's uncertain. So it kind of full circle, right? It actually is biologically based, and there is an evolutionary advantage to actually feeling pain when you have to make decisions that you are uncertain about.
If the body or the mind experience this physical pain, does more money alleviate the financial pain, or does that not have any effect at all? And if that doesn't have any effect at all, how do you reduce the pain?
So, so to answer your question, no. The pain that we feel when we have to make a financial decision has nothing to do with money, right? Yes, it has to do with money because we're making financial decision, but it has nothing to do whether you have money or not. I
Hmm.
can tell you that rich people avoid making financial decisions just as much as those people with less money. They might be making a different kind of financial decisions, but the pain is still there. Or sometimes they just hire people to make decisions for them because they have the money, right? They avoid making financial just the same because biologically we all the same. So the only way to reduce pain is to practice making financial decisions until it no longer feels threatening to us, right? So I know it sounds strange, but if you think about it, there are certain things that we don't no longer fear. Like, for example, drinking water. We don't fear drinking water. Now, why is that? Because we've been drinking water our entire lives. We condition our brain to know that drinking water is not something that threatens us, right? So, how do we condition our brain to know that drinking water is not threatening? By repeating, do it over and over again so that our brain is trained and say, when we drink water, everything is okay. Nothing's gonna, affect you negatively, right? Same thing with making financial decisions. If you want to not feel pain, you need to practice making financial decisions. You can start with really small ones, right? And then work your way up to something bigger. But the key here is to make it so that your brain doesn't feel like it's foreign. It makes it feel like it's something that they do already every day, and therefore it's okay.
Another question that I have around habits is this story you probably knows about this guy called Ronald Reed, famous
Yeah.
janitor and gas station attendant, who quietly amassed 8 million over his lifetime. And he's often cited as an example of consistent investing. But I was
Yep.
wondering if this kind of financial success is achievable for everyone, or does it very much depend on having a particular money mindset or archetype?
So let's go back to the story, actually. I love the story. But I think the part of Mr. Reed's story that actually doesn't make the news is actually more important than the story itself. That part of it that doesn't make the news is the man lived very frugally. He lived way below his means. And that living frugally is the key reason he was able to amass such a large sum over his lifetime, right? The other one, like you mentioned, is he invested, wisely. You know why that part of the story is not talked about very much? Because it's boring. Nobody ever wants to talk about a story just saying, oh, he lived frugally and therefore he has $8 million. Like, can you imagine a headline that says, living frugally is the secret to having $8 million? It's not attractive. Nobody wants to read that, right? But turns out that is the answer. So yeah, the formula to really amassing $8 million over a lifetime is living below your means, one, saving the difference, two, right? And then invest wisely, three. Those are three steps that everybody can do. So yes, to answer your question, yes, this is something achievable for everybody. But unfortunately, this is not something a lot of people choose not to do. Having the right money mindset and particular archetype, yes, helps, right? For example, the money vigilant people, right? They can probably achieve this a lot easier because they already have that mindset of like save
Yeah.
money, right? But just because you grew up with a particular money mindset or a particular money script doesn't make it doesn't mean that you can't treat money a certain way, right? Doesn't mean that you can't change that money script. So you absolutely can. So the secret, again, live below your means, save the difference, invest wisely, and that I can tell you everybody can do.
I want to talk with you about financial self-impression.
Okay.
So
Yep.
the question that I have is that let's say you look in the mirror and you see yourself as a financial failure
Mm-hmm.
and you're feeling overwhelmed by shame and you are reluctant to share that with the people you trust.
Mm-hmm.
How do you find strength to regain perspective and rebuild your self-confidence?
Yeah, that's a really great question because I think we're there a lot of times, right, in our journey, just living humans. But speaking of humans, it's also really important to remember that we all fail, we all make mistakes. That is part of being human, right? And that is what I want people to always remember. And the other thing is that we think people pay more attention to us than they actually do, right? And some psychologists call this the spotlight effect.
Mhm.
In essence, we are the center of our attention, and we mistakenly think that people pay just as much attention to us as we do, right? What we forget is that they are at the center of their attention. So if they're paying that much attention to themselves, they certainly don't have the time and energy to pay that much attention to us, right? So the result of that is what we feel about ourselves is often amplified in our brain because we think about our mistakes all the time, right? But nobody will think of our failure as critically as we do ourselves. And they certainly don't dwell on it as long as we do, right? So let's do an experiment. Robert, or maybe, your audience, think of a catastrophic failure that
Mhm.
somebody experienced,
Oh, I have
right?
many in my mind right now.
Not you experience, but somebody else experience.
Oh, okay, okay.
You see, there's a
Yeah,
difference, right?
yeah,
You can always remember your catastrophic failure. You think, oh my
yeah.
God, I did this and that. And you dwell on it, you think, But now think of somebody else's catastrophic failure, equivalent to something you experience. It's a little bit harder, right? It doesn't come to mind as quickly, right? Because we don't pay attention to them as much as we pay attention to ourselves, right? So to answer your question, how do you gain strength to regain perspective and rebuild your self-confidence? The answer is first, accept that we all make mistakes, big and small. We made it in the past and we'll continue to make it in the future. That's just part of being human. And the second piece is we tend to think of our failure in a very more catastrophic way than it actually is. Our mistakes are probably not as bad as we made it out to be. It's all in our head. And then also remember that those who truly care about us, they want us to succeed, right? So in many ways, we kind of owe it to them to kind of try again.
But
Hmm.
most of us, they're looking at social media, they're looking at their friends and their
Hmm.
family and colleagues, and those are huge amplifiers.
Hmm.
It's very easy to feel like you're falling behind. What can you do to untangle yourself from it?
What you actually touched on is another thing that we do a lot of, which is we are creatures of comparison. We like to compare. Why? Because comparison gives us context. So here's what I mean. If I were to tell you that 1,000 people attended a particular event, right? Just an event, how would you know whether that's a large number or a pretty small number, right? The only way to know that is to put it in context, right? So let's say I say, oh, 1,000 people attended a Premier League, football, soccer match, whatever, right? You think 1,000 people, that's very little. That those stadiums are huge, right? But if I say, oh, it's actually an attendance at a primary school, football, soccer match, not all of a sudden 1,000 people is huge, right? Context matters. The number
Mm.
itself, so not so much, right? So by comparing, we have context. Context gives us meaning. And meaning is exactly what we're looking for when our brain is doing that comparison, right? So it's a natural thing. Our brain does comparison all the time. But what happens when we compare the amount of money we have, right? What we do is we'll compare our full picture with other people's highlights. You don't know their full picture. All you know is their highlights, right? Sure. Okay, your friend makes maybe more money than you do. That's a fact. But do you know how many hours he has to work to make that extra money, right? So let's say he makes 50% more money, but he has to work 100% more hours. Now, if you know that, would you still feel bad about yourself? Probably not, right? But we only see, oh, he makes more money than I do. So when we compare our full picture with people's highlights, of course we're going to feel bad. We're going to feel inadequate. But that's not really a fair way to compare. It just is not. We should be comparing apples to apples, right? But since we can't always know the complete picture of the other person that we're comparing to, we should just tell ourselves that our comparison isn't a full picture. It's not apples to apples. That, they're just pieces of puzzles in their lives that we don't know. So people say, oh, why don't you just stop comparing? Well, like I mentioned before, comparison gives us context, and context gives us meaning. It may sound like a good advice to say, oh, just stop comparing. My mom likes to say that. Oh, just stop doing this. Just stop doing that, right? Sounds good on the surface, but it's actually not useful or practical because it goes against our biological need to have meaning in what we see. So instead, what is more helpful is not to say don't compare, but to compare and then very consciously tell ourselves, we don't have the full picture. And because we don't have the full picture, we're not making apples to apples comparison. So just know that whatever you compare is not the same thing. And that usually helps us kind of step back a little bit and say, oh, okay, yeah, maybe our situation is not as bad as we thought.
Let's talk about children and money. What is the right moment for parents to start talking about money? And are there any key subjects that parents should focus on?
Yeah, so I belong to the school of thought that I don't think it's ever too early to talk to our children about money, right? I think if you're able to have a conversation with your child, so maybe they're starting at like 3, right? You can talk about money. Now, obviously, the way you talk about money and the concepts you want to share with them kind of differs depending on their age, right? Because they have different kinds of understanding based on their age. But I think money should be a topic that you can talk about with kids as young as 3. At 3 years old, you can teach them about things like delayed gratification, right? Delayed gratification is actually very fundamental to savings and investing, right? It's about putting money away so that in the future you will gain something more than what you put away, right? Delayed gratification is huge. Now, you don't have to use money to help them understand that concept, right? You know about the Stanford marshmallow test, right? They give a marshmallow and say, if you wait 10 minutes, you get 2, right? That is illustration of delayed gratification. You can absolutely do that with 3-year-olds. They understand. Or like if they're a little bit older, like at say 5 years old, you can teach them something a little bit more complex, like what is the difference between needs and wants, right? Let's say you take them shopping with you. You can ask them like, oh, this is item belongs to need or this is item belongs to want. Have that conversation there. That way they get to, know the difference between the two and they can start differentiating between the two for themselves. And let's get a little bit older. When children goes to school, you can teach them concepts about earning money, maybe, right? Earning money in this particular case means money comes from work. It's not free. I think that's a pretty important message to share with children, so they don't think like, oh, money grows on trees. Whatever I want, I can get, right? In the U.S., it's a little bit controversial, maybe also where you are in Japan and elsewhere in Asia, is whether you should pay your children to do tasks around the house. Some people belong say yes, and she says no, But I think you can certainly pay them to do things outside of their normal responsibility. So whether you pay them for their normal responsibility is one thing. But let's say like you have a dirty car and instead of you washing it, you pay them to wash it, right? You're teaching them about earning money, right? I think those are really concepts that children at primary school can really relate to. I think at this age, you can also teach them, if once they have some money that they play with, physical money they play with, you can teach them about basic budgeting and like goal setting, with the money they already have. So it's just things that you can teach your children, even as young as 3. It just depends on, what they are able to absorb at that age and what kind of techniques you use. I do firmly believe, though, the earlier they get exposed to concepts about money and money management, the more time they'll have to learn and internalize those lessons, and the better they'll be when it comes to becoming an adult and managing their money. It's all about exposure.
I think you also write about it in your blog, and it's called Financial Anxieties That You Inherit. And because as a parent, you have accumulated over time certain experiences with money. And I was wondering that if they happen to be negative, how can you help your children to avoid your financial anxieties?
Yeah, that actually financial anxiety is something that I talk a lot with my clients just because it's just something that exists. And to talk about it to children and make sure they don't actually feel the anxiety is a whole different topic. But I think the error that we have there is we a lot of times think about financial anxiety as in how to talk to our children about money so that they don't have the same baggage that we do. But I think a better way to think about this is not how or even what, it's frequency. How frequently are you talking to them about money, right? So I'm sure you are familiar with mere exposure effect, right? The fact
Mm.
that a psychological phenomenon where we tend to develop a preference for things simply because we are familiar with them and we're familiar with them through repeated exposure. I think we can use the same concept there to influence our children in their thinking and behavior around money. We should absolutely normalize talking about money. Like the less you talk about it, the more foreign it is, the more anxious they would have about money because it's just unknown. When something is unknown, we naturally feel a little bit anxious about it, right? So we should talk about it when good things happen with money. We should also talk about it when bad things happen with money. Just talk about it often. It normalizes, right? And another thing that we should really think about is when I say talk about money when it's good and talk about money when it's bad, I should really clarify that the emphasis is not in it's not to make it so that it's emotionally charged, right? Even
Mm.
even though when money is good, money is bad, it's an emotional thing. The emphasis should be on making money discussions normal, right? So the best thing to do is to talk about money during very neutral moments, right? Like when you're grocery shopping, you can talk about like, oh, the eggs have increased in price, right? That's not a great thing, but we talk about money as if it's just a fact, right? Not some emotionally charged, like, oh my God, I can't believe we now can spend less money. No, that's not how you talk about money. You just talk about the facts. Or you can, talk about it when you're making family decisions, right? Just kind of establish comfort and kind of reduce the emotional weight on financial topics in general. The other aspect that I want to also talk about when we talk about framing money is to put it in a language that is empowerment, right? We want to always use language that make our children feel empowered when it comes to money. So like, for example, instead of saying, we can't afford that, we should reframe it to say, that's not a priority right now, right? It's technically saying the same thing, just in a different way. We can't afford that is true. It's also not a priority right now, right? But by saying that we're not a priority right now, we are making it so that they feel like they are empowered to make decisions with their money. So that kind of reframing also teaches a lot of children, teaches children a lot around money choices, right? So it teaches them money involves choice, is not a limitation. It teaches them that they have control instead of being powerless. It helps them understand that financial decisions reflect your value, right? So there's a lot of things that you can teach them about money that hopefully doesn't result in financial anxiety. Even though you yourself have financial anxiety, you don't have to pass that on.
Okay, I think we come to the end of our podcast. Ceres Chua, thank you so much for your time today. But before we leave, do you have 3 books that you recommend to our listeners?
Only 3, huh? I knew this question is coming because a lot of people, I mean, I naturally read a lot, and that's why 3 is not enough. But I'll you say 3, so I'll keep it with 3. So the first one is for sure Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. I think a lot of people know about it as a New York bestseller and whatnot. It's actually not a book about money at all. Instead, it lays out a lot of cognitive biases that heavily influence the decision we make in finance and also in life, right? It's a pretty thick book, but the writing is pretty easy to read and follow. So that's the first thing that comes to mind when it comes to psychology of money, even though he didn't talk about money at all. It has a huge impact. So I highly recommend that. I actually personally go back and reread that book every few years or so, just kind of refresh what I'm learning from it. So that's the first one, Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. The second book is actually about finance. It's called The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. So it's also a New York bestseller. Highly recommend it because it is, one, super easy to read. It's written in 20 or so chapters, and each chapter contains a lesson about money management from like a psychological point of view, right? So if you flip through the book, you notice that some of it's pretty common sense, like, oh, sure, to build wealth you have to save money, like that's pretty common. But there's also some that's less intuitive. Like, for example, there's a difference between getting wealthy and staying wealthy, right? So a lot of people, we don't think of the difference. In fact, we don't even switch gear when we need to. Let's say we gain wealth. Now it's time to preserve wealth. The strategy is actually very different, right? You take less risk. You do more to make sure that your money doesn't go to waste and blah blah, and those kinds of things. So those kinds of things are actually really interesting. That even as a money psychologist, I got a lot of it. So that's the second book, Psychology of Money. And then the third, I won't say it's a book. It's a series of books written by Jonah Berger. So Dr. Berger is a marketing professor at University of Pennsylvania, and he is an expert on social influence, on word of mouth marketing, and also on consumer behavior. He doesn't write about money, but a lot of his writing includes a lot of psychological tactics that marketers use to influence on spending money. So I would say if you want to know more about money, you want to know the other side of the story, which is how does a marketer influence us to spend money. So a series of his books are actually really great. Just, any of it I would recommend. So managed to slip more than 3, but I hope you don't mind.
Again, thank you so much for your time. And for our listeners,
Thank
if
you.
you have any comments or feedback, let me know. And I'm going to push now on the stop button.